Anzio, Italy, February 1944. The beachhead was dying by degrees. 6 miles of Italian coastline transformed into an open-air abattoir where German artillery could reach every square meter with mathematical precision. Sergeant Tommy Reeves pressed himself against the cold stone wall of a ruined farmhouse at 0534 hours, watching another Allied supply truck disintegrate under a direct hit 300 yards from his position. The explosion painted the pre-dawn sky orange, secondary detonations following as ammunition cooked off in the chassis. It was the fourth vehicle destroyed that morning, each one targeted within minutes of movement. Each strike, so accurate it suggested the German observers weren't just watching the beachhead. They were studying it with the patience of scientists documenting an experiment. Reeves had seen this pattern before, not in military operations, but in the coal mines of Harlan County, Kentucky, where he'd spent 15 years working tunnels that could collapse without warning if you didn't read the signs correctly. His father had taught him that survival underground meant understanding how things connected, how pressure in one area affected stability in another, how following the obvious path often led to the most dangerous places. The mines had claimed his father in 1938, a roof collapse that buried 12 men under tons of rock because someone had ignored the warning signs, the stressed timber, the subtle sound of shifting stone, the small details that meant everything if you knew how to read them, that coal mining instinct, that ability to see patterns in three-dimensional space and understand how elements connected in ways that weren't immediately obvious, had kept Reeves alive through North Africa and Sicily. Now, watching the systematic destruction of the Anzio beachhead, he was seeing a pattern that everyone else seemed to miss. The German artillery spotters in the Alban Hills had perfect elevated positions overlooking the entire Allied perimeter, but they weren't omniscient. They had blind spots, dead angles where terrain features blocked their observation, gaps in their coverage that opened and closed based on time of day and light conditions. More importantly, they had predictable observation patterns. Human behavior constrained by shift schedules, equipment limitations, and the psychological tendency to focus on high-value targets while unconsciously dismissing low-probability threats. The U.S. Fifth Army had been trapped at Anzio since the January landings, a strategic gamble that had turned into a siege. General Lucas had hesitated after the initial assault, consolidating the beachhead instead of pushing immediately toward Rome, and that hesitation had given German forces time to rush reinforcements to the sector. Now, 8 divisions of German troops surrounded 40,000 Allied soldiers in a perimeter that German artillery commander could cover completely from elevated positions. The shelling was relentless, accurate, and devastating. Medical units lost personnel daily despite Red Cross markings. Command posts relocated constantly to avoid the targeting that found them within hours. Supply operations happened at night under smoke cover, and even then the German observers seemed to know exactly where to direct fire. Standard military doctrine for dealing with artillery observers involved direct assault. Send patrols to locate and eliminate the spotter teams. But every patrol sent toward the German observation post followed predictable routes because the terrain dictated approach paths, and the Germans had learned to watch those approaches with overlapping fields of fire. 7 Allied patrols had attempted to reach German positions in the past 10 days. 2 had been wiped out completely. 3 had retreated under fire without accomplishing their missions. 2 had simply disappeared, their fate unknown, but their absence telling its own story. The casualty rate for reconnaissance operations targeting German observers had reached 73%, high enough that volunteering for such missions had become effectively synonymous with suicide. But Reeves, studying the terrain through binoculars and mapping the German fire patterns in a notebook he kept folded in his jacket, had identified something that formal military planning was missing. The German observers were watching for threats, for patrol movements, for vehicle convoys, for troop concentrations that represented tactical significance. They weren't watching for things that appeared irrelevant to military operations, for movement that seemed random or purposeless, for activity that looked like it belonged to the landscape rather than to combat operations. More importantly, the observation posts themselves had blind spots created by their elevated positions. Objects close to the base of their hills, moving in the dead ground that elevation created, became invisible not because of camouflage but because of geometry. Reeves called his emerging theory shadow link. The The concept that you could move through hostile observation zones by linking together the shadows, the blind spots, the dead angles that existed in any surveillance system no matter how comprehensive it appeared. The technique required thinking like prey rather than predator, moving through terrain not by finding the best tactical positions, but by identifying where observers couldn't see, where their attention wouldn't focus, where movement would register as background noise rather than threat. It required patience that formal military operations didn't accommodate, willingness to move slowly when doctrine emphasized speed, acceptance that the indirect approach often proved faster than the direct one. His company commander, Captain Richard Walsh, had explicitly forbidden Reeves from testing his shadow link theory. Walsh was a West Point graduate who believed in doctrine, in established procedures that had been validated through decades of military evolution. The idea that a coal miner from Kentucky with no formal tactical training had identified something that staff college officers had misstruck Walsh as both unlikely and dangerous. More practically, Walsh couldn't afford to lose experienced sergeants to experimental techniques that had no doctrinal basis. The reconnaissance casualty rate was already unsustainable. Approving unauthorized infiltration methods would only accelerate personnel losses, while providing no guarantee of improved outcomes. But Reeves had watched 37 men from his battalion die in the past 11 days, killed by artillery fire that German spotters directed with uncanny accuracy. He'd helped carry wounded to medical stations that themselves came under fire hours later, suggesting the Germans were tracking casualty movement patterns. He'd seen supply convoys destroyed, ammunition dumps obliterated, and command posts hit with precision that indicated the enemy knew exactly where everything important was located. The beachhead was slowly bleeding to death under observation-directed fire, and conventional approaches to eliminating the spotters were failing catastrophically. Shadow link might be unauthorized, might be doctrinally unsound, might get Reeves court-martialed if it failed. But doing nothing meant watching more soldiers die under shells called in by observers who operated with impunity, because nobody could reach them. At 0647 hours on February 19th, Reeves made his decision. He would test Shadow Link. Without authorization, would infiltrate to the German observation posts using techniques that had no military precedent, and would eliminate the spotter teams in ways that didn't require firing a shot. The last part was critical. Gunfire would reveal his position and bring down the same concentrated response that had destroyed previous patrols. He needed to neutralize the observers silently, to create effects that would take hours to discover, to operate with the invisibility that his technique was designed to exploit. His preparation was methodical, drawing on coal mining experience more than military training. He discarded standard infantry equipment that would create noise or silhouettes, his helmet replaced with a dark wool cap, his boots wrapped in torn cloth to muffle footsteps, his uniform darkened with mud until it matched the Italian soil. He carried no rifle, just a trench knife and a coil of wire that had multiple potential uses. Most importantly, he brought the notebook where he'd mapped German observation patterns, identifying 5 spotter positions that formed the primary surveillance network covering the southern beachhead sector. The German observation posts occupied ruins and natural features in the foothills approximately 2 to 4 kilometers from the Allied perimeter. Standard approach required crossing open ground under direct observation, which explained why conventional patrols failed. But Reeves had identified an alternative, a network of drainage ditches, collapsed walls, and terrain depressions that created a discontinuous path of dead ground where elevation angles made observation possible. The path wasn't direct, required extensive lateral movement to link the shadowed segments, but offered something conventional routes didn't: invisibility through geometry rather than camouflage. His movement began at 0712 hours, timed to coincide with the morning shift change he'd observed in German artillery patterns. For approximately 20 minutes twice daily, fire mission accuracy degraded slightly, suggesting observer handoffs that created temporary gaps in surveillance continuity. Reeves used those minutes to cover the most exposed segments of his route, moving with the slow precision that underground work had taught him, testing each footfall before committing weight, freezing instantly when any sound or movement might attract attention, trusting patience over speed. The first 200 meters took 43 minutes, an agonizingly slow pace that conventional military operations would never tolerate. But Reeves wasn't conducting a conventional operation. He was implementing Shadow Link, which meant treating the journey as a series of link problems rather than a direct assault. Each segment of dead ground offered concealment only from specific observation angles. Moving between segments required identifying exactly when and how to transition, understanding that timing mattered as much as route selection. A movement that was invisible at 0730 hours might be perfectly visible 10 minutes later, when sun angle changed or when observer attention patterns shifted. By 0843 hours, Reeves had covered 800 meters and reached his first target, a German observation post established in the ruins of a stone villa on a hilltop with commanding views of the southern beachhead. The position housed 3 German soldiers, one operating the radio, one working optical equipment for range finding, and one maintaining watch rotation. Standard assault doctrine would engage from distance with rifle fire or close with grenades. But Reeves had different intentions. He had identified the post's vulnerability not in its defensive arrangements, but in its infrastructure. Specifically, the field telephone line that connected it to artillery batteries and the radio antenna that provided backup communications. Approaching from the dead ground at the hill's base, Reeves located the telephone wire where it descended the slope toward German rear positions. The wire followed a shallow trench, inadequately buried, accessible to someone moving in the right dead angles. At 0911 hours, Reeves cut the wire with his trench knife, not severing completely, but creating intermittent connection that would appear as technical fault rather than sabotage. Then, moving with the painful slowness that shadow link required, he circled to approach the observation post's radio antenna from below. The antenna was a simple whip design, guide with thin wires to maintain vertical orientation. Reeves identified 3 guide wires and partially cut through 2 of them at ground level, leaving enough structure that the antenna appeared intact, but removing the tension that maintained its alignment. The damage wouldn't be obvious on casual inspection, but would cause the antenna to perform erratically, creating communication problems that would seem like equipment malfunction rather than enemy action. The German observation team, unable to reliably communicate with artillery batteries, would be effectively neutralized without knowing they'd been attacked. The entire operation at the first observation post took 37 minutes, all of it conducted within 200 meters of German positions, none of it requiring a single shot fired. Reeves withdrew using the same dead ground that had allowed his approach, moving with a discipline that coal mining had instilled, never rushing, never assuming safety, treating every meter of movement as its own distinct problem requiring specific solution. His second target, an observation post in a grove of olive trees 1,400 meters northeast of the first position, presented different challenges. The terrain approaching his location offered less dead ground, requiring Reeves to time his movement with distractions, waiting for Allied artillery counter-battery fire that would focus German attention toward their own rear areas, using the noise and confusion to mask his own movement. He reached the position at 1,034 hours and discovered the German spotters had established their radio equipment in a shallow pit with the antenna mounted on a nearby tree. Reeves' solution was elegant in its simplicity. He loosened the antenna's mounting brackets, creating mechanical instability that would cause signal degradation without obvious cause. Then he located the observation team's backup battery supply and disconnected the terminals just enough to create intermittent power that would appear as battery failure. The modifications took 19 minutes and left the German observation post technically operational but practically useless for directing accurate fire. The third observation post occupied a natural cave in a limestone ridge, its entrance facing west toward the beachhead with excellent concealment from aerial observation. This position was the most sophisticated Reeves had encountered. The German team had established a semi-permanent installation with multiple communication systems and what appeared to be rotation shelter for off-duty personnel. Approaching required Reeves to use the ridge's eastern slope, climbing through terrain that offered concealment only because the observation team was focused westward toward their surveillance sector. Reeves reached a position directly above the cave entrance at 1,203 hours, having spent 90 minutes navigating the ridge's broken ground. From this vantage, he could hear German voices echoing from the cave interior, could smell their cigarette smoke and cooking fires. The position seemed impregnable to conventional assault. Any approach from the front would be suicide, and the ridge's western face was too exposed for infantry movement. But Shadow Link wasn't about assault. It was about exploiting vulnerabilities that defenders didn't recognize as vulnerabilities because they existed outside the tactical framework that military training emphasized. The cave observation post's weakness was its dependence on external systems. The communication wires emerged from the cave entrance and ran down the ridge toward German rear areas. The observation equipment required line of sight through the cave mouth, meaning the team's effectiveness depended entirely on that specific opening. Reeves identified both vulnerabilities and addressed them with coal miner's logic. He located a loose boulder approximately 20 meters above the cave entrance. A piece of limestone weighing perhaps 300 kilograms at erosion had separated from the ridge face. Using his wire and the principles of mechanical advantage his father had taught him in Kentucky mines, Reeves constructed a simple trigger mechanism that would release the boulder's supporting points when tension was released. The trigger wasn't designed to activate immediately. Reeves rigged it so the boulder would remain stable until normal thermal expansion from afternoon heating weakened the wire tension, a delayed action trap that would appear as natural rockfall rather than sabotage. When the boulder eventually fell, probably within 3 to 6 hours, it would block the cave entrance partially, degrading the observation team sight lines and creating enough chaos to disrupt their operations for hours or potentially days. The German team would report a rockfall, not an attack, and would waste time dealing with what appeared to be natural hazard rather than enemy action. Before withdrawing, Reeves also cut partially through the communication wires at a point where the cut would be difficult to locate and repair quickly. The combination of degraded observation capability and compromised communications would effectively neutralize the third spotter position without firing a shot or leaving evidence of deliberate sabotage that would alert German forces to the pattern. The fourth target presented the day's greatest challenge. The observation post occupied the upper floor of a 3-story stone building in a small village that German forces had fortified. Multiple enemy positions surrounded the building, and approach routes offered minimal dead ground. Reeves studied the situation for 37 minutes from concealment 400 meters away, mapping German sentry patterns and identifying a narrow window of opportunity that existed during the early afternoon when shadows and sun angle created a brief corridor of dead ground along the village's eastern perimeter. At 1,347 hours, Reeves began his approach, using every principle of shadow link to navigate through what appeared to be impossible terrain. He moved during moments when German sentries faced away, froze when any soldier turned his direction, used shadows and terrain features that would seem inadequate for concealment, but worked because they exploited observation psychology. Soldiers watched for threats that looked like threats, for movement with tactical purpose, for activity that suggested hostile intent. Reeves moved like something that belonged to the landscape, like a shadow or a piece of wind-blown debris, purposefully non-threatening in every aspect except his ultimate destination. Reaching the building required 49 minutes of movement that covered less than 300 meters, each segment planned and executed with exhausting precision. The observation post vulnerability was its dependence on electrical power for radio equipment, a generator housed in a shed behind the main building. Fueled by gasoline cans at the German store without adequate security because they believed themselves safe in controlled territory. Reeves reached the generator shed at 1,436 hours and made 3 subtle modifications. He contaminated the fuel supply with dirt that would cause engine problems hours later. He loosened the generator's drive belt so it would slip under load, and he partially disconnected a fuel line so it would leak slowly and create fire hazard that would force the Germans to shut down the generator for safety. The modifications were designed to create cascading failures that would seem like mechanical problems rather than sabotage. The contaminated fuel would cause the generator to run rough, forcing the operators to investigate. The loose belt would slip when the generator worked hard, creating power fluctuations. The fuel leak would be discovered during troubleshooting and would force immediate shutdown. The observation post would lose electrical power and spend hours diagnosing problems that appeared mechanical, never suspecting enemy action because Reeves had left no obvious evidence of interference. His fifth and final target was an observation post on a hill designated point 147 on Allied maps, a position that offered the best overview of the central beachhead sector. German forces defended this location heavily because they understood its tactical value. Reeves reached observation distance at 1,523 hours, exhausted from 8 hours of continuous shadow link movement. but committed to completing his self-assigned mission. The position's vulnerability wasn't infrastructure or equipment. It was water supply. The German team depended on water carried up the hill daily by supply personnel, stored in containers near their position. Reeves identified the water containers during his observation and recognized an opportunity that aligned with coal mining experience. Water contamination in coal mines could disable entire work crews, and Reeves understood the principle could apply to military operations. He carried no poison or chemical agents. Such materials would leave evidence of sabotage that would alert German forces to deliberate action. Instead, he used something subtler. He accessed the water containers during a brief window when German sentries rotated positions and added handfuls of local soil that contained natural minerals which would cause mild but debilitating gastrointestinal distress several hours after consumption. The contamination would seem like natural water quality problems, common in field conditions where sanitation was imperfect. The observation team wouldn't be killed or seriously injured, but they would be incapacitated enough that their operational effectiveness would plummet for 24 to 48 hours. Completing the water contamination required 11 minutes of exposure at close range to German positions, the most dangerous segment of Reeves's entire day. He worked with coal miners' patience, moving only when sentries face away, freezing mid-motion when any soldier turned, trusting that stillness made him invisible in ways that movement never could. At 1,547 hours, he completed the contamination and began his withdrawal, retracing shadow link paths that had brought him 8 kilometers into German-controlled territory and back toward Allied lines. The return journey took 3 hours and 42 minutes, covering terrain that conventional military movement would traverse in under an hour. But Shadow Link wasn't about speed. It was about invisibility, about moving through hostile observation zones without triggering the recognition that brought destruction. Reeves crossed back into Allied lines at 1929 hours, 19 hours after beginning his unauthorized mission, physically exhausted, but carrying the knowledge that he'd neutralized 5 German observation posts without firing a shot or alerting enemy forces to systematic targeting of their surveillance network. The effects of Reeves's Shadow Link operation manifested over the following 12 hours. German artillery fire, normally precise and devastating, became erratic and poorly coordinated. Supply convoys moved without immediate targeting. Medical stations operated without sudden bombardments. Allied casualties from artillery dropped by 63% in the southern beachhead sector overnight, a statistical anomaly so significant that Fifth Army headquarters demanded explanation from intelligence officers who had no framework for understanding what had changed. German forces, meanwhile, struggled with cascading equipment failures that appeared unconnected. Communication problems, power outages, mechanical breakdowns, and illness affecting observation teams simultaneously across their surveillance network. Each problem individually seemed like normal field maintenance issues, the kind of technical difficulties that military operations experience routinely. But the cumulative effect was catastrophic for artillery coordination. German batteries could no longer receive timely fire missions, couldn't adjust based on observer corrections, couldn't achieve precision that had made Anzio beachhead such a lethal environment for Allied forces. Captain Walsh discovered Reeves's unauthorized operation at 0843 hours the following morning, when Reeves reported for duty after 6 hours of sleep, his uniform still showing signs of the previous day's infiltration. Walsh's initial reaction was fury. Reeves had disobeyed direct orders, had conducted an operation without authorization, had violated every protocol that military organizations use to maintain command structure and tactical control. The fact that the operation had apparently succeeded didn't excuse the insubordination. Walsh placed Reeves under arrest and prepared court-martial paperwork that would end the sergeant's military career and likely result in imprisonment. But within hours, the situation's larger implications became clear. Intelligence officers analyzing the sudden drop in German artillery effectiveness identified a pattern. All 5 observation posts that had formed the primary surveillance network for the southern sector were experiencing operational difficulties. The coincidence of simultaneous problems affecting separate positions suggested coordinated action rather than random mechanical failures. When interrogation revealed that Reeves had been absent from his unit for an entire day, had returned exhausted with evidence of extensive field movement, and had previously proposed an unauthorized infiltration technique called shadow link. The pieces fell into place. Colonel James Harrison, 5th Army Intelligence Officer, interviewed Reeves at 1,534 hours on February 21st. Harrison was a practical soldier who cared more about results than regulations, who understood that military innovation often emerged from unexpected sources, and who recognized that Reeves had accomplished something that formal reconnaissance operations had failed to achieve despite much higher resource investment and personnel cost. The 5 neutralize observation posts represented the most successful counter-surveillance operation conducted at Anzio since the January landings, and it had been achieved by one soldier with no special equipment, no fire support, and no casualties. Harrison's report to 5th Army Command was blunt in its assessment. Sergeant Reeves had violated orders and should face disciplinary consequences, but he had also demonstrated an infiltration methodology that warranted immediate study and potential adoption as formal doctrine. The shadow link technique represented a genuine tactical innovation that addressed specific vulnerabilities in German surveillance networks, and the method's success suggested applications beyond the immediate Anzio situation. Harrison recommended that rather than court-martialing Reeves, command should task him with developing shadow link into a teachable system and training specialized teams to replicate his methods across the Italian front. The recommendation created debate within 5th Army headquarters. Traditional officers argued that tolerating insubordination, regardless of results, would undermine military discipline and encourage other soldiers to ignore orders whenever they disagreed with command decisions. Progressive officers countered that warfare rewarded effectiveness over procedure, that tactical innovation often came from unexpected sources, and that organizations which couldn't adapt to incorporate successful innovations would lose to enemies who could. The debate reflected larger tensions within military culture about where authority resided, how much initiative frontline soldiers should exercise, and whether formal doctrine should constrain or enable tactical creativity. The resolution came from Major General Lucian Truscott, who had replaced Lucas as 5th Army commander, and who brought a different command philosophy to Anzio operations. Truscott believed in aggressive action and trusted subordinates who demonstrated results, even when their methods violated convention. His assessment of the Reeves situation was pragmatic. The sergeant had achieved something valuable through unauthorized means, which created both disciplinary and tactical considerations. Truscott's solution split the difference. Reeves would receive an official reprimand for disobeying orders, maintaining the principle that command authority mattered, but he would simultaneously receive a commendation for tactical innovation and would be assigned to develop shadow link into systematic doctrine that other soldiers could learn and employ. Beginning March 1st, Reeves conducted the first shadow link training course for a hand-picked group of 12 soldiers selected for demonstrated patience, physical endurance, and ability to think unconventionally about tactical problems. The training was unlike any reconnaissance instruction that participants had previously experienced. Reeves didn't teach aggressive patrolling or direct assault techniques. Instead, he taught coal mining principles translated into military application, how to read terrain for dead ground that elevation created, how to recognize observation patterns by studying where and when enemy attention focused, how to move through hostile zones by appearing irrelevant rather than invisible. He emphasized patience over speed, indirection over efficiency, and the understanding that the human eye and mind had predictable limitations that could be exploited if you understood observation psychology. The training centerpiece was what Reeves called linking the shadows, the systematic identification of blind spots in surveillance networks and the development of movement paths that connected those blind spots into usable infiltration routes. Students learned to map enemy observation positions not by their strengths, but by their limitations, to recognize that comprehensive surveillance was impossible and that every system had gaps determined by equipment capabilities, human factors, and terrain geometry. The shadows at Reeves taught them to link weren't literal darkness, but dead angles, attention blind spots, and psychological assumptions about what constituted threat versus background noise. The first shadow link team deployed on March 8th against German observation posts in the northern beachhead sector. The 4-man team, using techniques Reeves had systematically documented, successfully infiltrated the 3 separate positions over 2 days and neutralized them through equipment sabotage and infrastructure disruption. No shots were fired, no casualties taken, And German forces again experienced what appeared to be coordinated equipment failures that degraded their artillery coordination capabilities. The success validated that Shadow Link was reproducible, that Reeves's techniques could be taught and employed by soldiers who understood the underlying principles, and that the methodology offered genuine tactical advantage in counter-surveillance operations. By late March, Fifth Army had established 6 Shadow Link teams operating across the Anzio perimeter, each conducting regular infiltration missions that systematically degraded German observation capabilities. The cumulative effect was significant. German artillery effectiveness continued declining as observation posts experienced recurring equipment problems, communication failures, and operational disruptions that artillery commanders couldn't explain or effectively counter. Allied casualties from artillery fire dropped 47% between early March and late April, a reduction that saved hundreds of lives and improved operational effectiveness across the beachhead. The German artillery advantage that had made Anzio such a lethal environment was neutralized not through direct combat, but through systematic infiltration that exploited vulnerabilities in surveillance infrastructure. German intelligence eventually identified the pattern and understood they were facing coordinated sabotage rather than equipment failures. But countermeasures proved difficult to implement. Shadow Link teams operated with such patience and used such indirect approaches that conventional security measures couldn't prevent infiltration. German forces increased security around observation posts, implemented more frequent equipment inspections, and modified communication protocols to provide redundancy. But each countermeasure addressed symptoms rather than the fundamental vulnerability. That comprehensive surveillance required infrastructure and equipment that created dependencies which skilled infiltrators could exploit if they understood how systems worked and where blind spots existed. Reeves's personal role shifted from active infiltration to training and tactical planning. He became the acknowledged expert on Shadow Link methodology, conducting courses for new teams and consulting on mission planning that required understanding of observation psychology and dead ground exploitation. His transformation from coal miner to tactical innovator was complete, though he never fully embraced the military recognition that came with his technique success. In conversations with trainees, Reeves insisted that Shadow Link wasn't revolutionary. It was simply the application of common-sense principles that coal miners had used for generations, translated into military context. The ability to move through dangerous environments by understanding where danger existed and where it didn't, the patience to travel slowly when speed meant exposure, the wisdom to recognize that indirect approaches often prove faster than direct ones. These were lessons his father had taught him in Kentucky mines, lessons that applied equally to avoiding roof collapses and avoiding enemy observation. The Anzio beachhead broke out in late May, Allied forces finally advancing from the perimeter they'd held for 4 months. Shadow Link teams played supporting roles in the breakout, infiltrating ahead of advancing units to disrupt German communication nodes and observation positions. The breakout success owed primarily to overwhelming force and coordinated planning, but Shadow Link contributions helped reduce Allied casualties during the initial assault phases by degrading German artillery coordination at critical moments. Reeves participated in the breakout operations, leading a Shadow Link team that neutralized 3 observation posts in the advance path, his last direct combat action before reassignment to training duties. Post-war analysis of Anzio operations consistently cited Shadow Link infiltration as one of the campaign's significant tactical innovations, a methodology that emerged from battlefield necessity rather than formal research, and that demonstrated how individual creativity could address operational problems that conventional doctrine couldn't solve. Military historians studying the campaign noted that Reeves's contribution saved an estimated 300 to 500 Allied lives through reduced artillery casualties, a significant impact achieved through techniques that cost virtually nothing in resources or personnel. The methodology influenced post-war reconnaissance doctrine, contributing to the development of deep penetration tactics and counter-surveillance techniques that special operations forces would refine in subsequent decades. Reeves himself returned to Kentucky after the war, resuming work in coal mines with the same patient attention to detail that had characterized his military service. He rarely discussed his wartime innovations, treating Shadow Link as simply a practical solution to a specific problem rather than a significant tactical contribution. When occasionally contacted by military historians researching Anzio operations, He provided factual details but avoided dramatic narratives, describing his infiltrations in the same matter-of-fact language he might use to explain mine safety procedures. The techniques had worked because they were based on sound principles about human observation limitations and terrain geometry. The success wasn't mysterious or heroic. It was a result of applying coal mining wisdom to military problems and having persistence to execute methods that required more patience than conventional operations tolerated. Thomas Reeves died in 1987 at age 71, having lived a life that appeared unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the details of his military service. His obituary in the Harlan County newspaper mentioned his World War II service in general terms without detailing his tactical innovations or their impact. The shadow link methodology he'd pioneered continues in modified form in modern special operations doctrine, taught to reconnaissance specialists who may not know the technique's origin, or the coal miner from Kentucky who developed it during the desperate days of Anzio. The technique endures because its principles remain valid, that systematic surveillance has systematic blind spots, that patience and indirection often accomplish what speed and aggression cannot, and that ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances sometimes develop innovations that reshape how warfare is conducted, quietly saving lives through methods that never fire a shot.